Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do some work on the Tamiya, the Frog. We're up to step 11, squeezing the drive shafts into the gators. We'll be needing the gators, which come as one part, the two drive shafts, which are dog bone rather than the old hex drive of the original, and if we were to follow the instructions, we'll also need the anti-wear grease. The first job then is we need to separate and trim the two gators. The diagram in the manual has the bits we need to cut off shaded dark grey, so it's all rather nice and clear as to what you're supposed to do. I started by roughly cutting the gators in two, then carefully going around with a sharp pair of small scissors. This is a classic case of you can always trim a bit more off, but you can't add it back. So if you're unsure, be a bit conservative with the cuts. Next, we need to fit the gators onto the drive shafts, which is easier said than done. The ends of the dog bones are quite a bit bigger than the narrow bit of the gator. The trick is really just not to rush it. Work the gators a tiny bit at a time. It's tempting to use some of the grease to lube it up, which would make it easier, but I'm not sure what effect the grease is going to have on the rubber in the long term. Probably nothing, but why risk it? Tamiya also want us to grease up the ends of the dog bones anyway, so they're lubed up for the drive cups. But I'm going to wait until we're ready to fit them so we don't get grease everywhere in the meantime. Step 12, the rear arms. We'll need the drive shafts, 2 large body clips, 5 black O-rings, 4 bushings, which we will of course be replacing with proper bearings, the 2 wheel axles, and the 2 inner drive cups. For plastic, we have C6 and C9, the 2 rear arms. Essentially, all we need to do is pop a bearing onto one of the axles, fit it to the arm, and pop another bearing on the outside. But as usual with this kit, there's always something else. Tamiya are using O-rings to take up the slack in the drive shaft so they don't end up rattling around. We'll need to very carefully push an O-ring right to the bottom of the drive cup. Sometimes you can press it straight to the bottom with one of the small ends of a cross wrench, but if it just won't sit level, you have to resort to a screwdriver, preferably one with a nice blunt end, and perhaps even some tweezers. The same goes for the inner drive cup. This one has the pin in the end of it, which matches the top assembly in the diagram with the C6 arm. Now before we fit the drive shaft, we will apply a little bit of anti-wear grease around the inside of the drive cup. Usually on most models I'd run them dry, as the grease is an amazing dirt magnet and quickly turns into a grinding paste. But we've got the gators here, so they should stay pretty clean. Now we just need to pop the wheel axle on one end of a drive shaft and the inner cup on the other. Pass it through the bearings on the arm and clip one of the body clips where the drive pin goes. The other side, of course, is pretty much exactly the same, except the inner cup needs 2 O-rings stuffed in it. It's pretty easy to miss, but if you do, you might wonder why your buggy is rattling a bit. It wouldn't be the end of the world though. Step 13, fitting the arms. We don't need much here, just the 2 metal rear arm stoppers and 4 3x10 self-tappers. Now before we fit the arm, we're going to grease up the end of the spline that slots into the diff. It will make it easier to fit and reduce the wear a bit if there's any slop in the spline. When pushing the splines in, we're going to need to jiggle them around quite a bit to get everything to line up. It's important that you don't use a lot of force. You just need a fairly gentle pressure while working it and turning it until it pops in. Now I was in 2 minds whether to grease up the inner pivot point of the arm. On one hand, the grease is going to pick up all the dust and dirt in the world, but also the hole that it runs in goes straight into the gearbox, and the grease will help seal it up. I think in the end we can always wipe the excess off, which will still leave just enough to seal it. So we will use just a little bit of grease around the end before pushing it in. Same goes for the outside pivot point. We'll grease it up a little bit. Worst case, if it gets really grubby, we'll have to remove the 2 or 3 screws to clean it up. That just leaves the end plate, or rear arm stopper if you like. It just gets fitted with 2 of the self-tappers. Everything is nicely sized, so we can just do the screws up nice and snug without any binding. Very nice. Having said that, do check to make sure the arm does move fairly freely. If it binds heavily, then there's going to be something wrong that needs fixing. If there's just a couple of spots with a little bit of extra friction, don't worry. They'll soon free up once it sees a bit of use. Rinse and repeat on the other side, and that's the rear arms fitted. Step 14, damper shafts. Now these are a bit different from the original ones. As I understand it, they look pretty similar, but internally they're a modern damper, hopefully a little less leaky than the originals. We'll need the 2 damper shafts, 4 orange O-rings, 2 pistons, 4 2mm E-clips, 2 V5s, and when I notice there's also 2 V10s. Building dampers is one of those things where everyone has their favourite method. This is just how I tend to build them. First, we'll put the pistons on the shaft. The pistons get sandwiched between 2 of the E-clips near the top. Start with the inner clip, fit the piston, then fit the clip over the end. Next we'll pop the shaft through the bottom of the damper body before we fit the O-rings. Now, so we don't damage the O-rings, we'll apply some of the damper oil to the end of the threads. It's even better if you've got some thick silicone diff oil. It's really thick and sticky, but I tidied my bottles up a few months ago, so I've got no idea where they are. Never mind though, the included stuff will do the job. Now we can slide on the 2 O-rings and a V10, add a little bit more oil inside the end of the damper, slide the bits in, and lastly thread on the bottom cap and tighten it up. That just leaves the rod end, which needs to be threaded on the end of the shaft. We'll need to grip the shaft with some pliers, but we really don't want to scratch up the surface. That's a sure way to get a leaky shock. The standard trick is to use a little bit of cardboard in the jaws of the pliers. Grip the shaft good and tight and thread on the rod end. They don't need to be all that tight, just feel for the thread bottoming out and you're done. Step 15, shock oil. For this one we need the 2 caps, 2 rubber bladders and 2 V9s, the plastic tops. With the piston right at the bottom of the damper, we need to fill the body with oil. Fill it up so the level is just a couple of millimeters from the top. Then slowly push the shaft up and down a few times, being careful not to break the surface. Usually you'll see a cloud of bubbles come up through the holes in the piston. Now the Tamiya oil is thin enough that it will only take a couple of minutes for the bubbles to rise to the surface, so we can just hold the damper and wait. When using thicker oils, and especially longer dampers, it can be useful to have a stand ready so you can leave them for half an hour or so for the air to rise to the top. These ones though really don't take that long. Top the oil up so it's just about up to the top. With lots of practice you can eyeball it and get next to no overflow. If you're unsure, fill it right to the top, and when you pop the bladder on, be ready to mop up the excess. The idea being we don't want any air left inside the damper. Now we just need the plastic top and the cap. Put them together and screw the assembly on the top of the body. Tighten it right up and that's the damper damping. Same goes for the other one. When done, you should have a pair of working dampers. Step 16, springs and fitting. We need the 2 spring retainers, the C18s, the 2 springs, and 4 of the black shoulder screws. Now unlike most modern dampers, the springs are really quite short and only cover the length of the shaft. They pop over the end of the damper body, then we squeeze up the spring and fit a retainer. What you end up with is quite a funky looking damper. To fit them to the chassis, we just use the shoulder screws. Make sure the damper body is towards the front of the chassis and screw in the screws. And of course all the fits are good, so we can bottom the screws out without any binding. Fit both dampers, and that's the rear suspension complete. Next up we got the motor to fit, but I think I'm going to lump that in with the other electronics next time, so we've got the motor and servos in one video. Right, so that's about it for this week then. As always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!